everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Farah Urzuki, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We're really excited to be hosting this webinar through the Center on Budget's Emmy project, Elevating the Medicaid Enrollment Experience. We've been working more closely at the center with partners across the country on how to effectively gather and incorporate the voices of people with lived experiences into our work in advocacy, and with the Emmy project, particularly Medicaid advocacy. We recognize the importance of doing such work to promote policies and solutions that more accurately reflect the needs and experiences of those who interact with those programs and rely on them to stay healthy. We're really excited to be tapping into the extensive knowledge of our partners at Code for America, who have really vast experience in this area conducting user experience research and are really experts in this work. So Alexis and Deirdre are going to be joining us today to dive into the nuts and bolts of getting started with user experience research and how to conduct storytelling effectively. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we have many people joining us from across the country, which is wonderful. So we want to make sure that you please stay muted throughout the duration of the presentation. We encourage you to use the chat box to make comments or ask questions, and the presentation team at Code for America will be monitoring the comments and questions and making sure that your questions are answered. And so many people have also asked, this webinar is indeed being recorded, and we'll make sure to send the recording along with any relevant materials your way after the conclusion of the presentation. And I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. So with that, I'll pass it over to Alexis and Deirdre to further introduce themselves and get us started. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. We are all going to do introductions to kick us off. And I would love for everyone to go to the chat and share who you are, what organization you're with, your role, and the most interesting part, what is a song that instantly makes you smile? And this is just one way to get to know each other. And Deirdre and I will introduce ourselves and tell you a bit more about Code for America. I'm waiting to see it come in so I can comment in agreement with many of you.
It's funny, even though I knew the question in advance, I don't know what song I'm going to say.
Yeah, I wonder maybe Deirdre and I can kick it off, and I'm going to make you begin. Deirdre, why don't you introduce yourself and share a song?
Oh, wow. Really putting me on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deirdre Herstrid. I'm a qualitative researcher at Code for America. And I work in the safety net team. And a song that instantly makes me smile. There's an incredible French artist named Aya Nakamura, and pretty much anything that she sings makes me smile. So maybe I'll just say her as an artist. How about you, Alexis?
My name is Alexis. I am a service designer at Code for America. You'll hear more about our work in a minute. And I love Liana Lahavas and her Tiny Desk concert in particular. I know all of the beats that kick off every song, and if I hear it, I get instantly excited. Yeah. I'm seeing some good ones come in. I imagine it might take some time to remember and share, so please continue sharing, and I look forward to reading all of it. So today, we're going to talk you through 2 trips the research team at Code for America took to Louisiana and Minnesota. And along the way, we're going to share resources and tips so that you all can take these into your own research projects. And as Farah mentioned, it's recorded, and we've also taken the time to pull every single reference that we're going to make into a separate resource guide. So you'll have extremely easy access to follow up and do all of the readings and linking that we're going to share today. So you can kind of feel free to sit back and not take any notes, and there'll be a lot of resources for us to share at the end. So a little bit more about us at Code for America. We are a nonprofit organization that partners with governments, and we're all about delivery of public services and using human-centered design and technology. And the 4 program areas our work spans are the criminal justice space, tax benefits, the safety net, and we have a network of brigade members, so volunteers all around the country that work on the civic tech space alongside us and really represent our people power efforts. And Deirdre and I both work on the safety net, specifically on a team called the service design team. So we're really focused on understanding the human experiences within the safety net and creating actionable steps for our product teams internally and other organizations like the government partners we work with to take actionable steps based on the insights we find. And our three kind of main pillars of work are to show what's possible, help others, and build a movement. So we show what's possible by building different products. For example, we have a product called Get Cal Fresh that helps people sign up for food stamps here in California, where we're based. We help others by partnering and providing workshops to government partners and advocacy organizations, and building the movement, mostly through our brigade network, and thinking about how to bring others into our story and our hopes and dreams for the future. And we're here today to talk about storytelling and how to use research and stories to spark change. And Deirdre and I, on behalf of the research team, have come up with 3 words that we think good storytelling should be. Good stories are memorable, emotional, and personal. And we are going to share 2 of those stories today and hope that we demonstrate how to do so in that.
Cool, yeah, so I'm here as a resident storyteller for right now. And we're going to start off in Louisiana. So back in November of 2019, a colleague and I went on a sort of road trip in Louisiana. We were working on a project to help more people stay on the benefits that we know they're eligible for, so we can reduce churn, which I'm sure is a very common concept to most folks on this call. And we were starting a project where we were sending text message reminders to people at renewal periods to remind them that they had pre-scheduled interviews so that they would show up for them or be available for them, because we know that a lot of folks don't even know when their interview is. So it was sort of our hypothesis that this might help reduce churn. But for many clients, we realized that actually wasn't helping. And so we wanted to know, well, if text messages aren't the thing that's going to solve the problem, what's the thing that will help people be available for the interviews that will keep them on their program? And the only way that we could really figure this out is by visiting with people. What are all these other contextual things that are happening that prevent people from being available, besides even knowing that the call is going to take place? And so we visited about 5 clients in as many days around the state of Louisiana. And our last stop took us to a double-wide trailer in a really rural part of the state, really close to the Mississippi border. And the way we found this client is because she had opted into one of those initial text messages. And then we sent a follow-up saying, hey, would you like to participate in deeper research, and we'll compensate you for your time. And so she opted in. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call this person Danica. When we went to visit Danica, she was actually on her phone watching a video of a local sheriff's press conference about a recent murder. And as we were walking in, she said, actually, the person who was murdered was my cousin, a cousin that's like a brother to me. And that's a lot of weight that we're taking into this conversation. And we were faced with a choice, like, this is an emotional time that this person is experiencing. What do we do? We can go sit down and continue as if nothing is going on, or give her the promised incentive gift card and say goodbye, no worries, or reschedule. But we didn't want to make that choice for her. So we asked, we're flexible, we're going to follow your lead. What would you like us to do? And she said, come on in, I want the distraction. And so while we sat with her for about 90 minutes, we learned about some of the barriers that were keeping Danica from staying on the programs for which she's eligible. So she's enrolled in SNAP and TANF, and it turns out that she's taking care of 2 children, one of whom isn't her own. She lives next door to her parents, and they share food informally, but they live in separate spaces. And about 4 days a week, she travels over to the Mississippi border to work as a nurse in a dialysis clinic. And the reason for that is because the nursing restrictions are a little looser in Mississippi, so she can get her requisite hours. So it's sort of geography is important in this case. And when it came for her annual recertification for SNAP, timing was everything, because as you can see here, she was given a pre-scheduled interview appointment. which is really hard when she is working all of those days of the week, these 10-hour shifts. And so she had to take off a day of work on the day that she was expecting a call, because not only could she not take a call while she's at work, she also couldn't take a call while she was doing her hour commute, because she went through cell phone dead zones for like 80% of the time as she saw deer run across the street in a very rural place. And she took off work. What happened? The call never came. So she turned off of Snap, not because she didn't know that she had an appointment, but even when she adjusted her life to account for this call, the system didn't work, and the call didn't come as expected. So we found out that it wasn't exactly that the text messages weren't working. It was there were all these other contextual things that were going on, and we could see some of those ripple effects. So while we were visiting Danica, we took pictures of her home, the technologies she was using. You could see that cracked screen before, and the many animals that they cared for outside. This dog was very friendly and greeting us, and really enjoyed getting pet. So when thinking about your context, sort of like how to advocate for change, we knew that Danica's story could illustrate a much bigger trend than the agency leadership in Baton Rouge could really know about, because they hadn't gone out to visit folks. And it influenced our ability to advocate for change because we could communicate explicitly how agency procedures and policies and expectations fit into very specific experience, and not a particularly unique one. There are many rural people in Louisiana, and there are many people who are working and many people who are taking off work. So it was sort of like a point in time that by showing Danica's story and showing pictures and evidence of her everyday life, that we could really demonstrate and tell the story of how agency change and choices could have an impact on one individual's life. These stories can be memorable, personable, emotional, that could stand in for so many other folks. And we could also illustrate these ripple effects of the changes. So what happens when Danica takes off a 10-hour shift in a day? It means she loses that income, and it's not like she's getting SNAP benefits because of that. In fact, she's not even staying on the program that's helping her. So what we could do is sort of make human what seems like incidental or sort of scientific bureaucratic choices. At the end of this project with Louisiana, we shared out specific stories from clients, so stories like Danica's, and then we also shared out themes that emerged from all of our research. This was one trip of 5 clients. We took a couple of other trips. We did a lot of remote interviewing, and sort of coalesced those into one cohesive story. And the outcomes were phenomenal. After 2 years of working together, we found out that the Louisiana Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, ended up hiring 5 clients to act as in-house consultants. And they actually paid them double the minimum wage. They paid them $15 an hour. And they had a really diverse set of folks who were participating in this. I think a single mother, an elderly person, someone who had a visual impairment, and sort of giving voice to many people in the state who are experiencing challenges. And we have a blog post about this that you can read. It's linked here. And then we also found out that the state is now sending text message reminders to all of their SNAP participants. We had highlighted a small group and proved that it did improve outcomes through our sort of mixed methods research. I'm telling you about our qualitative bit. We also did quantitative metrics to understand the outcomes and impact. And I hear through the grapevine that's also happening for Medicaid. So folks in Louisiana are being communicated with the agency in a way that actually fits their everyday need. Folks don't get mail very frequently. Email can be challenging, and text messages are super direct. And so we found that this kind of storytelling really moved the needle on change, and helped people understand the value of individual client stories in agency change. Yeah.
So Danica's story, when sharing with Louisiana, we were wanting to make it memorable, emotional, and personal. And we're going to actually go back in time and retell the story, but this time pause along the way and kind of dig into some of the details Deirdre exposed. So, for example, we went to Louisiana and we were there to meet with a group of people. But you might ask, how did you even find these people, and why did you choose to visit them in their homes? And this came from a resulting kind of research plan that we were creating up front. And on the left here, you'll see a list of all of the things included in this kind of big, thoughtful plan where we're trying to form a research question. We want to know everything, and we always tend to look really big at the world. And so how do we get really specific on what our time with these people is going to focus on? There's a lot of different ways we could have gone about research. So we wanted to be really thoughtful about what we were doing and why, and how long it was going to take, the types of participants we think are most useful to talk to. And a few other things we're going to go into detail with today. One big aspect of that was choosing our research methods. And this also involved a whole lot of consideration. So in the sake of Louisiana, we wanted to, again, understand kind of the context around a text message. And we chose this method called Contextual Inquiry. And we came to that decision based on how we answered those considerations on the left-hand side. We had the team for it. We wanted to be there in person, and we saw a quantitative metric kind of push us into a place of seeing that churn was happening in the data, but needing the story behind it. So a little bit more about contextual inquiry. This is when you go to the context of the person's life. So in this case, it was Danica's home. We've also done this with a lot of caseworkers at their desk. We're actually able to see and point to things alongside their stories. And that's very different if you imagine over a call, or you're maybe in a conference room somewhere else in a building. The stories aren't paired with that reality. A lot of the times the researcher in a contextual inquiry is asking, that thing, can you show me that? Or where do you have that? What does that look like? So you're trying to pair stories again with the tactical environment around you, which led to many, many wonderful photos of dogs and cats that Danica cared for. We do recommend that this is a 2-researcher job. You really want to be aware of the power dynamics in the space, and more than 2 in a physical kind of home or desk can start to feel like a really off balance. And no less, and we'll talk about this later, for research safety, and also for the purpose of note-taking and documenting, and having someone be the facilitator and someone able to kind of take notes. We usually have these sessions last about 90 minutes, but you're reading the room and adjusting, as Deirdre already shared. Maybe it doesn't even happen for whatever reason, but you're shifting as the participant guides you to. And in general, it's super important, especially when you're in the space of others, that you are there to be a learner. You and us as the researchers, we're walking in with lots of knowledge about the system and the laws and the specifics of the acronyms of the agency they're referencing. And it's really hard to shut that off. And so we really purposefully step into contextual inquiries, reminding ourselves they're the expert of their experience, and we are there to affirm, learn, ask questions. Great. So that is kind of the plan we had in place. We knew we wanted to do contextual inquiries, and we had to go out and find people interested in participating. So how did we find Danica and the other participants? This is probably a very unsexy part of the research process, but it is so important to setting the tone, and it's all about recruiting. So a huge administrative lift where you're trying to find people that are fitting that kind of demographic, diverse participant that's representative of the people in the system you're trying to better understand. And you can see here on the right-hand side, this is a screenshot of a conversation with a potential research participant that we'll talk about in a minute, but is a form of direct recruiting. So it means Danica was already receiving text messages from the state of Louisiana, and we were able to use that existing communication channel to ask, are you interested in this research opportunity? And we're going to talk to you about it and share the details. So that was how Danica opted in, but there's a whole lot of other ways we've done it. We don't have those channels in place. Sometimes we're posting on Craigslist. We're looking at Facebook groups that are kind of on the same topic and might attract people that are in that space, and a whole lot of cold calling and cold emailing, if that's even a term. Librarians are great, depending on what you're kind of researching. I imagine it might be, you know who to call, you know the people who are connected to people. And we also ask clients, like Danica, for example, might have other people in her network that she could refer us to. So recruiting is a big lift at the beginning that also can involve screening and setting the tone and some of the things that just make sure that your time is well spent. And Deirdre also mentioned we pay clients. This is a quick graphic of the different rates that we provide. And for Danica, it was a 150 Visa gift card that, again, she gets no matter if the interview happens or happens for as long of the time or as little of the time as originally scoped. And we recommend trying to give cash as much as possible, literal physical dollars. And in a digital world, you know, we're using the Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, anything that can be as flexible. And as kind of a backup to that, we use a product called Tremendous that helps us send gift cards. But again, it's a Visa gift card. So we want to make sure that we're giving them as flexible cash as possible.
So this is the part of the story that gets further unsexy, which is the part where Danica told us that she was watching a press screening about murder. And so this is a perfect time to talk about trauma-informed research. At Code for America, we think a lot about trauma-informed research, how we might adapt and address our research to the trauma that people are experiencing in their everyday lives. And we know that the history and persistence of oppression play out in our research. And so we take action not only to notice it, but to mitigate its influence in our relationships that we're trying to build with research participants. So a couple of things that I want to talk about here is that we try to take the lead from participants as much as possible. And we make sure that they don't feel like they owe us anything. And part of that is practical. So about compensation, we give our compensation in advance of the conversation. So no matter how the conversation goes, that money is already in their hands. And we say, you know, it's yours, you don't owe us. we say a lot of these things explicitly. What else do we do? We also, I'll talk a little bit about consent forms later. We go through our consent forms very thoroughly and they're in plain language. So we have a way of talking about what they're agreeing to in a way that makes sense and is true. And part of it is also through tone. So we try to be compassionate in the way that we talk to folks, but not be patronizing, not try to problem solve, and not try to answer all the questions that they might have. We're trying to be helpful where we can. And if we know something that will change the outcome of their SNAP benefits, for instance, we're not shy to give suggestions if we know with 100% certainty that that's the right thing, always with the caveat that we are not agency staff. So we try to be helpful without being misleading. And we know that it's really traumatic to talk about many of the things that we ask. So we give time and space for that emotion. Practically, I bring tissues on every visit that I go on because often folks cry when they talk about this stuff. And so sometimes we're playing the role of researcher, but almost 100% of the time, we're also playing a little bit of the role of therapist. So it's important that we prioritize their comfort and their agency over our research needs. That's always going to be number one, while also making sure that we're protecting ourselves, because this is emotional work. So not only do we provide the space and time for clients to have an emotional response to the things we're talking about, we also give ourselves time and space. So in that Louisiana trip, I was driving around Louisiana in a car with a coworker. And after that particular visit with Danica, we just sat in the car for a long time and just talked and processed what we had just heard, because it was a lot for us. So I think that can be an underrated part of this process, but we also try to stack our research in a way that gives us that time practically. So we'll never do more than 2 visits in a day. And we try to have out just one because it is so emotional. We have some resources that we'll share as well. And then a little bit deeper on that is sort of about safety and practical safety. So we follow a couple of tricks and trades to keep ourselves safe. Always research needs are secondary to the safety of the researcher and the participant. And some ways we do that is that on every trip we bring a research buddy, and they serve a couple of purposes, and one of them is safety, to know that you're not alone. And if anyone feels unsafe, if either person feels unsafe in going on a visit, we talk about it, and if we leave, that's fine. We give the space to say it's okay, we don't have to do this. Our safety is more important. But there's also bias that comes into that we'll talk a little bit about too, about what we might consider safe and unsafe. So that's important to think about in this way too. We also use Google Voice. So the picture that Alexis showed before was my phone's Google Voice. I don't use my own phone number to text and call folks. And that's really helpful. And if you're working in a certain geography, like if you're in a certain state constantly, it's important to get an area code from that state for a feeling of legitimacy. We have some other resources about safety that we'll share in our resource guide. And then what else we want to talk about is research ethics. So I was saying a little bit before, what is safety and how do people feel safe? Something that's important to think about is how bias comes into a lot of our work. And we want to make sure that we're addressing that from the jump. So we do this with clients through some ethical standards that we follow. So we set realistic expectations. So before the visit, the reason that I had that screener phone call, and I do screening phone calls with every single person, whether it's a contextual inquiry visit or an interview or anything else, is to explain what it is that we're going to do and what our scope of influence is. So we don't want to promise things that we can't deliver, in the same way that we don't want to give advice about SNAP that we're not entirely sure of. We want to make sure that we're helping people instead of just being extractive and getting what we need from them. And so we'll say, we work at a nonprofit and we do not work at the agency, and we will pass along the information, but we can't guarantee any change. All we can do is try to advocate as strong as possible for what you need. And we make sure that we make a use of everyone's time, and those screener calls kind of serve the same purpose of identifying, is this person actually the right person to talk to? Part of it is, can we confirm what they told us in that survey or through a text message is a story that will tell us something about the work that we are trying to answer? And are they chatty? It sounds silly, but we try to make sure that folks on those screener calls will answer in more than one word. It gives us an indication that they'll be talkative enough to tell us something that we can work with and help them with. And then invite them back. So we, in another effort not to be only extractive in this work, we give folks money, which is important. It's sort of like redistributing wealth in some way too. But more than that, it's another way to be ethical, to show them what came of their research. We're telling them, we're setting realistic expectations at the beginning, and then there are 2 points at which you might want to share information back with folks. One of them is during the analysis and synthesis phase. So you've now come out with some story or some theme that emerged from what this client shared, and you can share it back with them. Did I represent you correctly? And this is a point where you actually need to be open. If you're offering it, you need to be open to what they say. If you got it wrong, you need to be open to changing it to actually represent their true experience. And then that last is the deliverable. So whatever final thing is coming out of this work, sharing that with them and saying, by the way, this is what I'm going to share with other folks. And some folks don't actually want to see that. And so part of that rapport building that will happen at the beginning, through the screener call, through being really sincere when you're going through the consent form, will give that space for a client to say, you know what, I actually don't care what comes out of this. Just, I want to tell you my story and get this gift card, and that's fine. So it's really all about giving agency to folks and not presuming that you know what they want. And then there's a piece about bias that I was touching on a little bit earlier. We make a lot of assumptions about how things will happen. My screen doesn't look like that. And so when I'm testing these text messages, they look different than what they look like in person. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. So I think there are sort of 2 biases that folks in our position are considering. One of them is a personal bias. I would ask you to raise your hand if we were in person, but we're not. So maybe virtually, think about raising your hand if you've taken any of the project implicit tests through Harvard. It's been around for a while, and I find it really interesting to think about these implicit biases that we hold and how they could come to play on our work, especially about race, ethnicity, poverty, all of these things. So we bring that. That's sort of our lived experience that we're bringing into this work. The other is sort of like a hazard of the job. And Alexis alluded to this earlier, which is like experiential bias, or like knowing too much bias. We know a lot about the policies and legislation that drive a lot of the experiences that folks are having. And so when Danica didn't get that phone call, I was like, I know why, but I'm not about to share that. It's not useful, it's not helpful. And it also contributes to a power imbalance that already exists. So I want to, as much as possible, level the playing field between us, and telling clients about acronyms and stuff like that doesn't help. So on that note, power dynamics. In the role of researcher, we do set the tone. We're coming in with the money, we're coming in with the resources, we're coming in with the questions. So there's no way to deny that there are power dynamics at play in conversations like this. But there are a couple of ways that we try to mitigate it. And so some of that we've talked about already, right? So we provide incentives at the beginning of the research session, not the end. We dress in casual clothing. We're not wearing a blazer to go visit someone in their home. We're wearing jeans like folks might be. And a lot of it is about tone. So coming in, starting a workshop with music, there's sort of like a tone that we try to set in our conversations. It's a very similar tone that we try to set with clients. So coming in, asking about the dog, being questioned about, the little girls' dance performances. There are these ways that we are very human because we are human. And so as best we can, we try to diminish those power dynamics, and we say it outright. A lot of times we will say, you are the expert in your life experience. There are no right or wrong answers. You can't disappoint us. You can't make me upset. All I want to know is your experience. So I'm here to learn. And even saying that very explicitly can be very powerful for folks to hear when they don't have a lot of power in many circumstances. So we try to create that kind of environment.
You'll remember Danica's dogs and the different photos we've shown you of her space. And you might be wondering, why are you taking all these photos? You were there to talk about text messages. And we're going to now touch on the topic of note-taking and documenting in general. And when we do interviews, especially contextual interviews, we try to capture in a lot of different ways. So you can see all these different formats. There's always someone taking pen and paper notes. We avoid bringing laptops or trying to type as much as possible. I know things are a little different now as we move to remote first, but just being aware of how note-taking, again, is either reinforcing, can be reinforcing of those power dynamics and having a physical barrier. So it's pen and paper, audio recordings, videos, and photos, again, if the participant consents to it. And some of the best practices, just good old note-taking. And in an interview, what that means is trying to be a transcriber. So you might be noticing things, you might be connecting the dots and having these kind of aha moments yourself, but as a note taker, you want to be representing the verbatim words that are coming out in conversation, and you're documenting very unbiased kind of facts. If possible, if we think about now when we transfer to a remote world, when we have note takers join and we're doing sessions over video, we have that person turn off their video after a quick hello, this is what I'm doing here. Again, to kind of fade into the background, it should be this constant kind of quiet buzz. And I guess a note to that is also, when you are note taking, you never want to stop. You're going to be very tired at the end because it can feel as though the note taking is also guiding the conversation in a really weird way. Like, I'm only going to record the things I want to record, or what you're saying isn't really as important. It doesn't matter if I even record what you're saying, and it might actually kind of guide the conversation in a really unintended way. And one other thing about note taking is at the end of each interview, we like to schedule kind of this debrief time and say, give time for the team to kind of walk away, collect your first reactions, and emotionally decompress. So note taking is something that happens and continues after the interview is over as well. And when we go beyond the note taking, we think about general documentation. That's where those kind of photos and videos come in. Having someone assigned to documenting is really helpful. And we know that images can act as such a powerful visual. So for example, this photo of the screen being cracked versus the photo of someone else's uncracked phone screen just shows so much more than any text description could be. So we're trying to look for those opportunities where photos can do more than words can. So we talked also about how at the end of this project, we gathered all of our findings and recommendations and kind of brought Louisiana into conversation and workshops about that. And so we want to just talk about how to decide what that final format looks like. And we think about deliverables as doing many, many things, and getting clearer on what you're trying to drive will help you choose what it is you're building. And I think we're going to encourage everyone to think super creatively about the ways stories can be shared. So storytelling at the end of a research project can be really focused on driving empathy. It could be mass knowledge. It could be sharing as widely as possible, or it could be sharing with a very specific group on a very specific decision that's coming up. And so making sure to have that conversation with yourself of what it is we're exactly trying to influence, and choosing amongst an ever flowing list of formats. So the ones that are most common to us and many kind of advocacy organizations are presentations, kind of PDF reports, and then the list keeps going and hopefully starts to go outside those boxes a little bit. So for example, workshops, we've done exhibitions, built different websites, social media campaigns. You can see the list here. And I will be sharing, I think up next, some photos of all of these to kind of expose some of those. One note before I share those examples is that Code for America recently created a visual guideline that I'm super excited about. It goes into such granular detail of how to have a values-based approach to choosing and collecting kind of images to tell stories. So for example, power dynamics, which we've brought up often, is something that gets represented in the photos that you choose. So you'll be able to go in and read this resource in full, but every little last choice about how you're representing that story can continue to be diverse, inclusive, and respect the power dynamics at play. So we keep that in mind no matter the format. So to kind of show you again some of these other deliverables outside of our project in Louisiana, we've built kind of custom websites for a storytelling purpose that's really easy to share to a wide audience. Smaller audience, a gallery walk. So gathering all of the stories and insights and having it physically posted for people to interact with in a way that a kind of digital PDF is not able to achieve. Sometimes it's just good old text. This is a memo we sent to FNS about SNAP, and as a result of some of our work with the senior population. And I so look forward to the day when we can print things again and gather around them, because I do think the power of an analog thing for people to point to and feel is a huge part of our storytelling efforts, and something that we are trying to recreate digitally now. So here are all the photos to recap our conversation with Danica and the outcomes of our Louisiana project. And these are all the things we just talked about. And we are excited to continue to a second story where we'll learn more. And this time it'll be based in Minnesota.
So we're going up the Mississippi. I secretly would like to have a project in every state that touches the Mississippi. So if any of you work in states like that, I am curious. I'm only partially joking. So we're going to talk to you about Minnesota. We left off in Louisiana. We were working in on that trip that I told you about before. That was November 2019. Our work in Minnesota kicked off in earnest in January 2020. interesting timing. And we were brought to Minnesota in part because of some work that we did trying to analyze the accessibility of online applications across all 50 states. I think Eleanor will drop that in the chat. We're calling it sort of our 50 states landscape analysis. How long does it take folks to apply? What kind of barriers exist between clients and the applications that exist online? And we found that Minnesota, I think, has the second longest time in our analysis for folks to apply for food stamps, cash support, and Medicaid. It takes about 2 hours for folks to fill out 2 different applications. And we approached the state and said, hey, would you like to work on this together? And by gosh, they did. And so we were really excited to start to figure out what is going on in Minnesota that makes it so hard for folks to apply to these programs that they need. So we also went on some trips pre-pandemic, and I saw some questions in the chat about post-pandemic or during pandemic research, which we'll be happy to talk about during our Q&A. In this instance, we met Salim at a downtown branch of the Minneapolis Public Library. We were connected to him through the social worker at the library who I had cold emailed the previous week and said, hey, do you know anyone who'd like to talk to us about their benefits experience? And he was pretty quiet. Salim was pretty quiet during our group interview, but he opened up as we asked more direct questions about his experience. Born in Ethiopia, Salim is a native Amharic speaker, and he also speaks English perfectly. And he brings all of this life experience to the conversation that we had. So we spent more one-on-one time with Salim because we wanted to get to know him a little bit better. And before our conversation, we talked through our consent forms and how we'd safeguard his information, particularly because we know that folks have had a lot of negative experiences with government entities, and we don't want to reproduce those. We've mentioned that a little bit before. And we didn't want to exploit him even unintentionally in our effort to fix a system that's really already failed him many times. At 72 years old, Salim has been homeless for the past 8 years, and he stays outside when he can, and he goes inside when the Minnesota temperatures drop to what they are today. I think it's 0 degrees today, and make it really untenable to stay in his tent in the park. So what he said to us is, currently I'm staying in a small shelter, and I don't like living in a shelter because there's a lot of men that have issues. Sometimes a lot of the people just came out of prison, so it's when the weather is good, I try to stay outside. And we make all these assumptions about what people want and need, and then we meet real individuals who have real preferences, and tells us a little bit more of the texture of individuality. And Salim told us about how he lost access to benefits many times over the course of his life because he didn't get mailed renewal notices. So especially for folks who are experiencing homelessness, he may have been staying in the shelter during his initial application, and then the summer came, it warmed up, and he went out to his tent, and he missed the mail that was going to his shelter. He said, because I move around a lot, I don't get my mail. So a lot of the time when I go to the doctors, they say your insurance is not current and I have to reapply. So we're seeing a bit of that churn that we were talking about in Louisiana, and where we come in this particular state is in that reapplication process. Now he has to reapply for benefits. How can we make that experience better and make that loop a little bit tighter so he can get not only through the application process, but also through the entire enrollment process? So we came to Minnesota to figure out, why is it taking 2 hours for folks to apply for SNAP, cash, and Medicaid? But from Salim, we heard a story about how, yes, it's hard to go online. He can go at the library, but how the sort of loop, the full loop of the application experience extends beyond this digital product. And so we were able to weave in stories like Salim's to communicate to the agency how their choices play out. So how other communication methods might better meet folks' needs. Especially, we heard a lot during that trip with Salim that a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness are victims of theft quite a lot. And so they lose their cell phones. And so there's, I think it's called Text Now, or there's another app that a lot of folks use to keep the same phone number for text messaging that they can access over Wi-Fi, even if they lose their physical device. And so we were thinking about other ways that communication can adapt for people's real experiences. So that was one trip. I think that was February 2020. Here we are in March 2020. I'll never forget the dates, right as we were told, come back and don't come back into the office. But this is our last trip pre-pandemic. And part of our recruitment method is to just have a lot of informational conversations. And so I had put out a call on my personal Facebook page and said, hey, does anyone know anyone who does direct service in Minnesota? I listed some occupations. Maybe they're a librarian, maybe a social worker, maybe a faith leader, like a pastor or rabbi, maybe a social worker. So anyone who works in direct service. And I got some little ripple effects through that. And I ended up having an informational interview with a librarian at the University of Minnesota who directed me to this incredible project developed by youth in North Minneapolis called the Social Service Runaround at an organization called Juxtaposition Arts. And the youth put on this program to simulate what it's like to literally have the social service runaround of going from table to table, to have to talk to different people in different ways, and trained agents, so I think it was city leadership and staff in the city of Minneapolis on that experience to sort of humanize that process, which incidentally is a great deliverable from research to give folks the opportunity to sort of experience it themselves. So I cold emailed the project coordinator for this and said, hey, I'm really impressed by this work. Can a colleague and I come visit with you all? And we were invited to one of their weekly meetings with all of the youth leaders. And we learned about the origins of their project. We asked them some questions about how we could do our work well and any ideas they had for us. And then we actually had 2 one-on-one interviews as a result of the conversations with these amazing youth. So we met with Salim, we met with a bunch of folks in his community, we met with a bunch of folks from the Juxtaposition Arts community, and we ended up with a tremendous amount of data. So these were 2 week-long trips where we ended up with hundreds of pages of transcripts from our interviews and conversations, dozens of pictures, hours of audio recordings and video recordings. And then we came back to the office. What do you do with all of that? You know, we went out to sort of learn and met many people, but we ended up with more stories than we could do any particular thing with. And so we had to make meaning of it. And so we tried to figure out what is that process going to look like? And what Alexis showed you early on in our research plan, we also had a synthesis plan. So we knew precisely, we had a list of all the pictures that we wanted to capture. We had a list of all the questions we wanted to answer, the kinds of audio that we wanted to get in order to fill out this picture and know what kind of synthesis and analysis we would end up doing at the end, because the strongest research deliverables are really coming from the strongest research plans. So what we ended up with after, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, after all of this research, synthesis and analysis, was what Alexis rightly titled a big old presentation that we presented back to agency leadership in Minnesota, and these 5 vignettes that told individual client stories. So you can see at the top there, we gave them pseudonyms, some little pictures, their approximate age, where they live in the state, and a sort of summarizing quote, something that represents them. So Kimberly, in this instance, I'm testing my eyesight here. The quote we used for her said, most people are on more than one benefit, so why wouldn't we tie them together? I think you could probably make a choice on an app, like what to apply for. Why wouldn't you want to just try to do it all in one? An incredibly perfect quote for a project where we came to create an integrated benefits application. And then I would tell her story. So having one individual person to think through, and these were intentionally created in such a way that they could be printed out and posted up in an office so that folks could reference this person a lot. They could talk about Kimberly, they can think about her experience. Sometimes in research, we might call that a persona, but I don't really like that. I think a persona tends to be an amalgamation of lots of people to represent a more holistic group or a more heterogeneous group. In this case, what we prefer is telling individual stories. So this truly was this one particular woman who we chose to call Kimberly to give you a sense of this person's experience. And we would have been in person had our timing not been for March 30th, 2020. This is a picture from our initial kickoff visit, but we did present those client vignettes and that presentation that summarized a lot of the themes that we found through our synthesis and analysis over a Zoom call to the folks who were in this room at that time. And we also integrated a lot of what we heard from folks into our eventual product design. So in the end, we're creating, it's now live. You can see the site up there, demo.mnbenefits.org, and you can click around. You can go through the entire thing if you're interested, and it won't submit any of your data. And you'll see part of it is that we offer folks a different way to interact with the agency. So not every county, Minnesota is a county administered state, not every county has text messaging, but what we have done is that there are some counties who encouraged us to use different language. So this second line here, by choosing a box below, you consent to receive electronic updates. They use that as their consent. So now when they see that a client has opted in on MN benefits for text messaging, they can just start texting with them through the system that they've procured in that county, instead of having what they did before, which is a large DocuSign consent form. So their initial text message used to say, fill out this DocuSign form so that you consent to text messaging. We could create something that allowed for folks to more easily opt in, and counties would use that as their consent. And email, so at the end of the application, we don't mail a consent or a confirmation to a person's home. We email them that confirmation and give them some next steps. So we're trying to slowly adapt. You know, we can't change everything all at once, and we can't make it so that mail isn't part of our FNS or CMS policy, but we can adapt a little bit to help folks get the information in the way that they need. So that was great. So this is the story of research in Minnesota. You can see all of our summary pictures here. We developed quite a bit, and this was only over the course of about 3 months, I think. Yeah.
So here we are back on our 3 words, that stories, we seek to build stories that are memorable, emotional, and personal. And we're going to repeat the same format by going back in time and going to the beginning of the story, when we set out to understand Minnesota a little bit more and having to come up with the research questions to ask in order to learn more. We wanted to take a few things into consideration. So we've done previous work across the safety net, and we wanted to utilize that knowledge and understand a different area or look at things from a different lens. So we wanted to make sure we weren't asking the same questions that either we or others have already asked and really powerfully answered. So that's a combination of looking inward, what we've done, looking outward at what other organizations have done. There's a lot of logistical, what do we think we can pull off with this research? Again, we don't want to ask questions that won't serve our next purpose, and kind of going with that principle of not wanting to waste people's time. So we're thinking of what those deliverables could look like and the types of change we might inspire, and the benefit both to us and our participants that we're able to drive. A really challenging part of this is just getting the right level of specificity with your research questions. So we're trying to show you what it looks like to ladder up and down that specificity. So it's easy for me to get to a place of, wow, why is it so difficult to get public benefits? It's really big. There's a lot of different answers. And you might start there and ask a few people that to then help you narrow and say, out of all the reasons why it might be difficult, we want to actually zoom into this one moment in time of an applicant's journey. So we're thinking about applying. Code for America has a lot of expertise in that moment of the journey, but it's specific to Minnesota. So Deirdre had mentioned with Salim, his experience in the winter and what that means for his access to mail. That's not something we in California experience. And that was one way to make this really big question a little bit sharper and a little bit more focused. And what we really wanted to stay away from was going too small. So this is an example of what we would consider too small for this project, at least, is why is it difficult to submit a verification document in person in Minnesota? So we wanted to make sure we were at this sweet spot of being able to see that larger context of a human and their experience without walking in with really specific goggles about the technology piece at this moment in time that might not actually be applicable to the larger experience. We went to library, talked to Salim and a few other people. And this is where we're going to talk about in-depth interviews as a contrast to contextual inquiries that we talked about with Danica in Louisiana. So in-depth interviews, these are not in context. And these are really good for understanding how the brains of the participant, how it works. So they're how they think about their past experiences, how they think about problems, and really what their decision-making process looks like. This is ripe for activities to do together. It's something you can do in both contextual or in-depth interviews, but it's less about show me the world around you, and we're here together to have a conversation and react to some of these activities we've designed to facilitate a conversation. We plan for about an hour, and again, it's kind of 1 to 2 researchers, and we try to make the tone of these equally casual to our other contextual inquiries. And one thing to keep in note with these in-depth interviews is often it can be in a really stodgy room in the back of a building, and sometimes that's what it has to be, but really being intentional about the space that you're in can be one way to change an in-depth interview from being intimidating and something that's not going to yield really meaningful results to something that makes Salim feel comfortable to tell us more about his experience.
And part of this is going to the place that make people feel most comfortable. So oftentimes we offer people, where would you like to meet for an interview? It doesn't have to be in their home. It doesn't have to be in context. In this instance, we met at the library where Salim is about 5 days a week. And that was part of his consent. You know, he's consenting, he's made that decision. That's the agency that he has in deciding where we meet. The other part, we've been talking a little bit about consent obliquely until now, and I'll just address it straight on. We take safeguarding people's information, their personal information, very seriously. We're not using Salim's name. We're not showing you his face. We're not telling you any identifying information about him because we told him we wouldn't. And he agreed to let us share anonymized quotes through a consent form that we share. So in pre-COVID times, we would bring this physical consent form, this sort of foregrounded picture here, and they have check boxes so clients can check off what they agree to. And you can see it's very plain language. I'll just read it off. I'm not sure you can see it here. It says, I agree to let Code for America interview me. And so it's not anything that they wouldn't understand in an interview when we talk about it. Take photos of me, take a video recording, observe me and take notes. So we're using very plain language, and oftentimes we'll share this before we even have the interaction with the client. So sometimes I'll text clients the consent form and say, you don't need to review this in advance. It's not homework, but if you'd like to, you can, and then go over it again in person. So we want to make sure that we actually give people the time to not only consent, but be in an informed way. And now during COVID, we do that on Google Forms. We sort of optimize for tone and clarity more than we optimize for like specific legalese, because it's also a measure of trust. So we explain to clients what the purpose of the study is. Again, it's sort of setting realistic expectations, how that information and data will be shared and used, how we're going to delete their data as soon as we're able. They get the choice about how their information will be recorded, whether that's through notes or audio, video, whatever else. And we have a separate part of the consent form that says being interviewed is completely voluntary and up to you. I can almost read this off without actually looking at the words because I say it so much. So basically we tell clients, you can stop at any time. You won't hurt my feelings. You don't have to answer any questions that you don't feel comfortable with. Just tell me and we will move right along. And you don't have to, we can stop the recording at any time. We can stop note-taking at any time. We can leave whenever you want. And even after the fact, a month, a week, a year from now, you text me and say, I'd like for you to delete all the information I shared with you. No hard feelings whatsoever. We'll be happy to do it. And we have to make that true. So we have to have a plan, and that's part of our research plan, how to deal with data and how to protect PII. And so we have plans for how we delete data over time. What else is here? And we also talked a lot about all of this data that we collected. So what do you do when you have hundreds of pages of transcripts and hours of audio recording. What we don't want to do is use our initial biased things that we think are most important in order to draw conclusions. And this is a very common thing, right? The first thing that we do after having an interview or a contextual inquiry visit with a person is have a little debrief. What came up for us? What was both emotionally and practically? What did we hear? What are we feeling? And we write that down and we consider that part of our data. What were our initial responses? But that's absolutely not it. We can't rely on our memories because we just can't hold all of that in our minds, and our bias is going to drive what we consider important. And we also want to make sure, there are two people generally that go on trips like this or conduct interviews and note taking. We try not to share out too soon with other members of our team or agency folks, because we don't want to unintentionally seed. There are a million types of biases. This sort of like initial, the thing that they're hearing first as being most important. And so what do? We analyze and synthesize all that data. So analysis we generally think of as the time that we're setting up all our data, bringing it all together, putting it all in one place so we can make sense of it. And synthesis is sort of that meaning making, and it's a little less linear and a little bit more frustrating. So we generally plan, and this is part of our research plan, to take about 2 to 3 times as long in this process as we do in the initial data collection. So for every hour that we're spending with a client, we're planning for 2.5 to 3 hours of analysis and synthesis. We also write down in our research plan what our assumptions and hypotheses are to hopefully mitigate them. Again, we can't erase power dynamics, we can't erase biases, but we can't erase, hypotheses or assumptions, but we can mitigate them by naming them. It's incredible how powerful that can be in a way of just noticing it and setting it aside. And we try to be wary, like I said earlier, of prematurely sharing out research insights. So part of the analysis process for us is choosing a coding method. So I'm sure anyone who's done anything in social sciences before is familiar with inductive and deductive coding. So we generally decide early on, before we start this process, if we want to start with a code book, or if we want to develop one through an inductive process of sort of letting the data guide us. And it depends how much time we have. It depends how much we know about the system. It depends how much we're going to learn something new and want to be surprised in the process. And that's an oversimplification of that choice, but you'll get the idea. We also have some resources about this that we'll share afterward. And we use a couple tools for them. I think the next slide has Airtable. Again, I would say raise your hand if you've heard of Airtable, but you can't. I mean, you can, I just won't see it. So Airtable is a glorified cloud-based, what do you call this? Spreadsheet tool. So what I really like about it, you can get a free version if you want to play around with it, and then you can pay for a little bit more features. In this tags, you can see the tags column right in the middle. Instead, like in Excel, you would have to do fancy formulas to have multiple tags in one field. You might have to have multiple fields in order to have different types of tags. Here, you can do all this fancy mapping where you can see the second, if you go all the way up to the top in your mind, the tags field, you can go into each one of those tags. They call them linked records, and see everything that has that tag. So it gives us a really fast way of starting our next process, which is really common for us, which we call affinity mapping or affinity diagramming. And we use a tool called Mural. There's another one that's frustratingly similarly named called Miro, M-I-R-O. They both effectively work in the same way. Basically, there are digital sticky notes. So pre-pandemic, we would all get together in a room, or we would have a bunch of whiteboards all around, and we'd print off all of the quotes and observations from our research. Not every single thing. It's also a way to sort of narrow our synthesis, our analysis process narrows from those hundreds of pages of transcript into the quotes and the observations that we think are going to be the most useful. So we're not going to capture we're not going to capture everything about the person's, daughter's dance recital, but we'll capture enough of it to give you some character and some information that will relate back to our initial research question. And we bring them all together. So I think this one is from a set of interviews that we did with caseworkers. And it talked about, we talked about verification documents, we talked about metrics and measuring success. And so this was an inductive coding process where we just brought together all of those observations and quotes and mapped them together to establish themes. One of the parts of synthesis that I definitely don't want to gloss over is the amount of time that it takes just to think. I think that we don't account for this because it doesn't look like work, but walking away from those physical boards, walking away from the screen where you have all your digital sticky notes up and just thinking. I like going on walks. I like, sometimes I'll go on walks with colleagues in person. We'd go and get coffee and talk about stuff. Now I'll go on a walk with my headphones and talk to someone, and they'll go on a walk just to think about things. Go on a run. These are all of the times that I think are not seen as productive work, but actually can lead to that aha moment that gives you the connection between what you're seeing on the screen and what the story is. So for your work, it's a little bit interesting because we tend to do both. We tend to both go out and talk to folks in order to understand an individual story, but also understand thematic stories, and we call these insights. So we're bringing together not only, so on the right, you can see the vignettes that tell those individual stories. And frankly, that's the easier part to do. You're trying to represent someone. The harder part is getting to something that will drive action. And this can be really profound, both for internal teams and when you're sharing out with external folks. And these were some of the key insights that we came up with from those research sessions that we did over those 2 weeks that I told you about. And a good insight is one of the hardest things that you could do. Synthesis is, I think, the most challenging part of research. And insight writing is like the aspect of that is really hard, because a good insight not only tells you what you found, it also is an inspiration for change. It also drives you to action. And so this insight here, oh, now I'm going to embarrass myself because I wrote it a year ago. I don't know if I like it anymore. Clients don't trust themselves to apply for benefits without the help of others because application forms are hard for them to understand. So we're seeing there's something happening here, right? Number one, it's specific enough to say, not only are applications hard to understand, clients do something about it. They get help. They get a lot of one-on-one help, which is not scalable. And it doesn't work when people don't know who to ask for help or don't have that person in their network. And so for us, for the state, we have to think about ways that we can make an application so easy that people can do it on their own. And so what does that actually mean? And that's sort of a call to action for all of us to say, what would it be, or what would it be like for a client to work with an application that they understand on first read? That could be about digital accessibility. It could be screen reader compatible, it could work on a cell phone, which is the way that we know that most people who are experiencing poverty access the internet. It could be written at a 5th grade reading level, so it's really understandable even for non-native speakers. And so there are all of these things that come out of those insights. And importantly, it draws back to that research question. So in some ways, it has a relationship to the initial question that we were asking. And then we're talking a little bit about how we deliver that stuff. So we told you that we gave a PDF and we had a slide deck and we had these other things, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of it can be really hard to communicate when it's a standalone thing. So we try to make choices about how to present and share out what we've developed from these hours of research and synthesis. And so in this case, in Minnesota, we were meant to be in person. We ended up doing it over Zoom. So we walked people through the slide deck that had those insights, that had other recommendations for things that we would do in this work. And also made it such that it could stand alone. We knew that people would share this PDF around, so we wanted it to have enough information that it could stand alone. And it's interesting as a sort of meta moment, if we scale back a little bit, the way Alexis and I organize this slide deck is so it kind of does both as well. So there are many slides that would make no sense if you were just seeing them out of context without any narration, like a picture of a cracked screen. But we also have these kinds of description and sort of teaching slides that can work on their own a little bit. So another way, well, actually, maybe I'll talk a little bit about a couple of those things you had there, Alexis. Other ways that we might think about sharing out are some of the things that Alexis mentioned before, like the workshops that we've led with state leadership. We ran a workshop with Louisiana leaders for about 4 hours, teaching them Research 101 and sort of teaching by doing, which was really impactful. And then there are other things like what the Juxtaposition Arts Youth did, which is that sort of day in the life activity where they set up a simulation for folks to walk through. Other things that you might consider are like using audio and visual in a certain way. So you can create a set of clips of videos or audio. We have a colleague who presented a really powerful conference talk where in part she had someone audio of the participant on the speakers and would gradually add in specific quotes on slides. So there was a visual, quotes and also the audio of it, and that could be really powerful for people. Or transcript coding exercises. So this is one thing that you could do. You could pick out a page or 2 or 3 of a particularly important moment in a conversation that you've captured in a transcript and task people with doing some of the coding that we did. So we've done this before where we give them different color highlighters and say, okay, you're going to look for something that's a barrier. What did a client experience that was hard that they had to overcome? Or what's a coping strategy? So we give them some keys to start them on that process. And reading the conversation with all of those ums and pauses and uncomfortable asides gives people a little bit more of a relationship with the client as opposed to the more tailored things that we might share out. So that's that. We told you a lot about Minnesota, and here's a little bit of an overview of what we shared. What's the next slide have on it? And these are the points that we had in those purple slides. We tried to pull them out a little bit. We talked about forming research questions, in-depth interviews, consent, analysis and synthesis, and another take on storytelling for advocacy. And we hope that we've conveyed through our little storytelling that it can be and should be memorable, emotional, and personal. And these are the things that stick with people if they have a particular relationship with someone who they are personally advocating for, and delivering deliverables in a way that people can be reminded of that through something they can print out or a postcard or something like that. So today we've traveled, so to speak, up the Mississippi from Louisiana to Minnesota. And we've learned a little bit about research basics and how you can employ them in your work. We hope you can adapt them for you. And what we're going to leave you with, we'll send, I think Farah will send this out afterward. We have a resource guide that coalesces all of the things that we mentioned during our conversation. And we're also going to share all of the purple slides with you, the ones that have sort of title and description about the different methods and different things that we think about during our research. I believe that's it. Is that it? One can only know. Yes, it is it.
I am going to place a question in the chat just to kick off as we transition to more of a Q&A for the next 10 minutes or so. And I'd be so curious to hear from the group, what is one of the things we talked about that felt like a duh kind of moment? You knew it, you've seen it, you've done it. And what is something that felt totally new and expanded on a part of research that you'd never explored before? So I'm going to pop that in chat, and anyone else that wants to maybe ask a question, this would be the time to come on video and share.
Yeah, Alexis, maybe you want to stop sharing so we can invite people to share their video to ask questions. Thanks. Feel free. We're on video. You can be too. So maybe we can start off, Alexis, actually with one question that I saw asked in the chat a little bit earlier, and I think you're a good person to answer it, which is Amber wrote, tips for short form storytelling like social media posts and policy advocacy. Do you have any ideas about how folks might start to think about really short form storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I would love for our marketing colleagues to have the, more expert answer here. I'd say from my experience, the design of social media is to catch your attention quickly and as abruptly as possible. So that's where quotes, photos, audio clips, videos are a really good way to draw people in and bring you to another place on the internet where there's more information for them to learn. So build your deliverable and then look for those really compelling kind of snippets that can then be shared over time and pull people back to that place where they can go to learn more. I wonder if anyone that shared that specific question has like more context or constraints they're working through that might lead to a more specific answer on our end. So anyone with the social media question, feel free to either chat or share now. Otherwise, that's my kind of quick take.
Yeah, and I'm wondering how visually you can make a complement between what you share on social media and the more long form things. I think Code for America does it fairly well. So if you go to our Twitter account, you might have some inspiration there. I'm curious now if folks have any thoughts about Alexis's question in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself or write a response in the chat, something that felt like totally new to you or really old news. You can't hurt our feelings. Yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat, Frankie saying that it's expensive to pay people. Yeah, we are lucky to have the funds for that. We also budget for it. So part of our research funding is a line item for incentives for clients, because we do think it's an incredibly important ethical standard to set, that we are paying people for their time just like we are being paid for our work. It is labor to tell stories. It is labor to explain traumatic events. And so we want to make sure that we're compensating people for that. But I can understand that it's a new ask a lot of the time. So you have to figure out precisely what that argument is to adding a line item for incentives. And we think it's about equity in the end. It just can be a very compelling argument.
Hi, this is Melissa McChesney. I work down in Texas. I think one of the things that kept coming up for me as I watched, this incredible work you're doing is how to scale it down to where a person is doing it as part of their job, like myself, and maybe with the help of, an additional person or two. Whereas it seems like, y'all had the resources and the ability to sort of just focus in on this and spend 2 weeks gathering stories, that sort of thing. So trying to figure out how to scale this to make it fit the size of our projects and the bandwidth that we have, which is not much.
Yeah, that sounds tough when you're being asked to come up with a research plan, go visit someone potentially. It's a lot of emotional labor that you're doing, going through the synthesis process. It's quite a lot. I would say, figure out how your current work fits into it. I mean, it's an incomplete answer, but I would say like setting aside time for it can be as little or as much as you want, and it can be over a time scale that works for you. So I think that the most comprehensive thing, we went down for a week. What would it look like if you're saying over the course of 3 months, I want to talk to 5 people? What is your time scale? Who are you trying to share with? What is the urgency of that thing? I would gather that a lot of the stories that we hear, at least, it's variations on a theme. Like we know that people are experiencing hardship, and the way they're experiencing it differs state by state, person by person. But the urgency of it is that you can decide, what you want that urgency to be. So what you could do is decide, okay, 1 week, I'm going to spend an hour drafting a research plan. I'll spend another week editing it. I'll spend another week doing recruitment and starting to talk to people. And then you also want to give yourself some time in between each of those conversations to reflect on that research protocol that you wrote. So you have some questions. It could be good, in fact, to wait a little bit and not the next day talk to a new person, but instead spend a week, do some of the coding of that interview, or bring together that interview into Airtable, for instance, and spread out that time between interviews. So I think we have this sense of urgency about some of this, but we create it ourselves. So you don't necessarily have to do it all at once.
Yeah, and I think one piece of recommendation or advice is I think whenever because we're faced, these are research examples where we were, you know, fully staffed, we could go there, we could be there. That's not always the case for every single project. And so when we are in a kind of scaled back reality, I think for me personally is like the deep thought of this is not something to lose. And so even if it is, you know, only a few hours, giving yourself that time and space to really get in the zone of this work, I think would be better than trying to jump into it across the path of a week. So if your timelines look different and your energy is pulled in different directions, just trying to make that space carved whenever you can find it, I think would preserve some sanity and also give you the chance to like get into the depth of the activities.
Thanks to you both.
Hi, my name is Shamir. I'm a policy analyst with the Fiscal Policy Institute in New York. Thanks so much for this presentation. This has been super insightful. I think it's easier for me to say what felt totally new because there weren't a lot of duh moments for me. But one thing that we've been planning on doing, we're in the midst of just like networking and trying to get groups to, you know, connect us with people who might be able to participate in our project. And so we are working on our interview protocol, doing all of these things, but having an assigned note taker with their screen or like their camera turned off was completely new to me, but seems like a duh thing to do. So I thought that was great. And also thinking about like the time, not only that you'd spend doing the interview, but like debriefing afterwards. Those points are definitely two that will stay with me.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's the part that is really helpful to think about, which is like the support of you as a researcher. Oftentimes we're spending quite a lot of time asking for people to help us understand their situation better. And so we're sort of asking them to do a lot of emotional work. But what we try to think about a lot at Code for America is the emotional toll that puts on people to hear it, that sort of secondary trauma. And so we also have an internal practice. It was even better when we were in person, where we would every other week, everyone who does direct service or direct asks questions of people directly goes out for coffee together for an hour and talks about some of those hard things. So there's sort of both the point in time processing that we can do and having a buddy to do that with, and sort of the larger scale, how does that secondary trauma compound over time and create you know, an emotional burden that we need a little space to process. And therapy is great too. Yeah. I saw another question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, hi, this is Vicki. I'm in Boston with Mass Law Reform, and I'm wondering about, for some of us who work with organizations that either do provide direct services or maybe one step removed, work with other organizations really closely that provide direct services like legal aid organizations. Storytelling is very much part of legal advocacy. To what extent we can kind of incorporate those relationships in building a story, or if there's some sort of, I don't know, ethical issue there. It seems like getting your client's story is what you have to do, and it's just a different way of using it, and obviously with the person's permission. So anyway, I'd be a little interested in talking about it from that perspective. Your thoughts, that is.
Yeah. I was waiting for Alexis to say something, but I think she will next. I think that those are the relationships that are kind of the best. We think about different ways to recruit, and some of those are talking to folks directly, Craigslist, Facebook, snowball recruiting, where a person refers us to a friend or family member, and so on. But having a really deep relationship with a legal aid advocacy, healthcare navigator groups, we go to them all the time and we say, hey, do you have anyone who had an experience and wants to chat with us about it? And I think all of this is based on trust and relationships. So you don't want to overextend that relationship, and you don't want to constantly ask the same people for help in connecting you with people. And you don't want to blur into this line of being exploitative, even unintentionally. Exploitative, how do you pronounce that word? Either way, you don't want to do it. So it's really a sort of relationship navigating technique in asking for the right thing at the right time and not too often. And knowing that a lot of people are doing their own work and are actively helping people. So you don't want to detract from that. So what you want to figure out is the right balance of asking people for connections without making an additional piece of work for them.
I do see another question here about when people are too busy to talk to us for an hour at a time and what other methods might be a better fit. And I think the specific question was about surveys. I wonder, Deirdre, if you maybe want to touch on surveys, but I do want to share a different method in addition is trying to think creatively about, for example, we've sent things to people in the mail, which we know we hate, but we find a way to get them activity kits that they can do on their own time if they do have that. It doesn't involve face-to-face or even any call, but it's filling out a worksheet we've given them, or finding ways to have them really bring it into their life if and when it's possible. Along with diary studies or another thing you can do where it's them like literally like vlogging their life or trying to weave in ways for the research to really feel part of their daily, an attachment to what they're doing daily rather than a way to step aside and carve time separately. And surveys are also a different way to interact. So Deirdre, I don't know if you have survey thoughts.
Yeah, we place a strong emphasis on what we call mixed methods research at Code for America. So we, Alexis and I, conduct qualitative research. We have data science colleagues who run large scale surveys, and they can tell you a lot about it. I think we have some blog posts about that we can share also, and maybe we'll add it to the resource list about how we run surveys. And they have strong feelings about how to get the right people. There's also a way to extrapolate demographic data from surveys without getting a self-report from people. So we use, if we have their last name and a zip code, there's a way to infer their race and ethnicity, which can tell you a little bit about them. You can also ask, and then you can desegregate the data by those measures. But it's a tough one that I can't answer precisely, but surveys are a great method that we highly encourage you to use with a lot of thought. And I know we're at the end here. I just wanted to address Louise's question about sending people into the state. This is something that we've encountered recently where we're working with the state of California, and we're trying to navigate those kinds of conversations where we're deciding whether or not we want to hand people off, basically help them with recruiting. And one way that we're navigating this is by being very upfront with the people that we're recruiting and telling them about what we can promise and what we can't in that relationship. And also we can go over the research protocol with the state staff beforehand or whomever they've deputized to ask those questions. And we can also sit in on the interview, or we can offer to lead it for them with one of the state staff as a note taker. So there are a number of ways that you can navigate this, but I think hand-holding as much as possible and being extremely upfront with the client about what they're agreeing to and what could happen is really important in that case. But it's hard because you want the state to hear from clients, but you obviously don't want to re-traumatize them in the process. Yeah, I think we're at time.
Yeah, so we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Alexis and Deirdre, for such a fantastic presentation. I hope you all learned something. I definitely did. And as we mentioned, we will be sending out the recording along with the fantastic resources that the team at Code for America has put together for us. And I'm also including in the chat a link to our listserv so that you can subscribe and get updates in the future about webinars or other learning opportunities. But thank you all so much for joining, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.